Well, welcome everyone. I'm Pastor Joe. I'm the family pastor here at Centerpoint. This is the last week. Our lead pastor, Pastor Mike, is off. He'll be back next week. I know he's itching to get back into the book of Genesis, but continue to lift him and Bethany and the kids in prayer as they get to enjoy this time with their newborn. Sure, it's been just a whirlwind of excitement. I saw it on the kids' faces when they came in, and Isaac was proclaiming to everyone that he had a baby. So that was cool. That was really cool. I'll have to admit, I like to preach. I love to be able to be used by God in this way. But to be a part of the team that's teaching on the book of Genesis, I was just a little bit intimidated. Genesis is an incredible book, very complex, very deep, and full of so much. And my own human thinking, when I began to prepare for this, yes, I was intimidated. I remember back in one of my undergrad classes, we actually spent a few weeks exploring the timeline in Genesis. And I know there's debates among many out there between whether you believe in young earth creationism or old earth creationism. We're not going to get into that today. But from the time that God created Adam to the end of Genesis, where the Israelites begin to move into Egypt with Joseph, there's around 2,400 years. And it can be walked through. You can see all the dates. Everything lines up. And I remember those few weeks where we were going through that, how in awe of that I was. Like, here's the first book of the Bible. Here's the first thing God wants to reveal to us. And it just amazed me that we can actually piece together, like, all these different things, how they work together through all the different family lineages. And I mention that because as we study a book like Genesis, we should come into it with an awe and curiosity of all that God has in there, right? There's just so much history in there. Like I said before, it's very complex. And many of the stories, like we're going to read today, all point to the same thing, right? As you read through Genesis, it's God interacting with his people right from the beginning. And then he's directing his people. He's introducing everyone to this amazing plan that he has, which really is, as you see throughout Scripture, is his desire to be with us, right? So Genesis really is that launching point for the whole book of the Bible that we read. And in today's story is just a minuscule part of those 2,400 years, and yet it's a story that can speak to every generation and has impacts on all the generations to come after this story, right? So I want to ask as we begin, have you ever been in a position knowing God is asking you to do something, but it involves waiting? Or he asks you and then the wait comes, right? Or those moments when you know you should be responding to something, or you feel that nudge from God, but you hesitate to take that step? Something or someone makes an entrance into your everyday life, and you know that you should respond in some way. You know that God's calling you to do something, and you don't, at least right away. And sometimes we do respond, right? And then we grow impatient. We begin moving forward with our own plan. We begin moving forward with what makes sense to us. Or maybe you don't remove God from the plan, but you do like I've done many times, you run ahead of him, right? Anyone been there, done that before in your life, seen someone, if you haven't? And I believe it's in these moments that our faith and trust don't seem as strong to us as what we want or believe it should be, right? And maybe I could ask you, have you ever gotten to the point where you're just so tired and worn out from waiting, you've been praying, that you just don't want to do it anymore? You don't want to pray, you don't want to hear from your Christian friends, keep going to your knees, right? Maybe you've been there. And I believe today's story, as we dive into it, should hopefully encourage us when we're in those moments, right? Before we get to our reading for today, just want to recap a couple of things. A couple of weeks ago, Nathan Nedepak was here, and he shared from Genesis chapter 12. This was where God first calls Abram to move to the land of Canaan, the promised land to be. And what I find interesting is the only information God gives him is from verses 2 and 3, where it says, I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be blessed. You will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you. That's pretty much all the explanation God gives to him to move to Canaan, right? Now, it's pretty good, and we know that Abram obeys, and he goes there, right? And if we do further study in chapter 12 on this call, we know that God's setting in motion, right, for the place where his people will be held in captivity and then 400 later be brought to this promised land. And Nathan highlighted this idea of trusting without all the details, which I loved. Anyone ever experienced those moments when God's moving and he gives you very little to go by or even the why behind it, right? Any of you that are in leadership in a business or an organization and you've done trainings or seminars, more often than not in any kind of leadership training, at some point you might hear that you should give the why behind the what, right? And this is to help motivate people, right? Or a team. When they get that why, they become energized and empowered. And yet, we have a God that often does not always give us the why, right? Sometimes it's even complete trust and a blind trust that he's asking from us. And we'll get to that more soon. And then Nathan finished up with this challenge. He asked, are you willing to go if you don't know the where, the why, the who, the when, or the what? And as I read that, I quickly wanted to answer yes, and then I thought about it for a second. I don't think that's a tough question to answer with a blanket yes, right? Because there are certainly certain situations or circumstances where I will say, yes, Lord, I'll go, without hesitation. But across the board, no matter the circumstance, a complete yes right now, without knowing where he's going to call me, if I'm honest, that's hard to say yes on my own, right? So as we jump, we're going to be jumping 4 chapters ahead this morning into chapter 16. But right before that, in chapter 15, God also makes a covenant with Abram. So 2 weeks ago, God calls him and promises him he's going to be great and will be blessed, and he will bless many people through him, right? And now in chapter 15, God makes a covenant, and this is where he has the vision, and he questions God about having an heir to his kingdom because God has not given him a son, right? And through that vision, God promises him that he will have a child through his blood that will be his heir. And through that, he'll provide him with a son. And he even says that his offspring will be as many as the stars in the sky, right? And what I find about that story that I always love is right away, Abram, in verse 6, it says he believed God, right? And then God credited it to him as righteousness. Just a simple trust. Okay, I see the vision. I believe you, God. You're going to do that. And God sees him as righteous. And then a little further in that vision, he actually shares how 400 of his people will be kept in slavery and captivity and then be freed and return to this very land that he's brought them to, right? So Abram's doing pretty good here, I think, right? Him and God are connecting. God says something, Abram believes without hesitation. God calls him a righteous man. He promises him the son, the heir that he's been desiring. You know, if we looked at this and stopped right there, all is good in the neighborhood, right? Abram is building a trust with God, and he believes when God says something, he's going to do it. How many of us have ever used the statement, in God's timing, or have heard it? Probably just about everybody in here, right? And let's face it, if we're honest, we don't really want or accept any kind of timing except for our own. I believe a lot of times when we actually use that statement, well, it's in God's timing, is usually, not always, but usually it's come through after we've seen God do something, or it's a little half-hearted. Yeah, it's in God's timing. In the back of our mind, we're like, I hope it's in God's timing, right? And I think it's okay to have that thought as a human being, because we do find our strength from seeing him come through. We do build our trust and faith in him by seeing him come through. So I understand where that comes from. But where it falls short is if we desire to see God become faithful in our lives, to see him come through, and then we see it, but don't actually allow that then to build us, to strengthen us. Or I'd like to call like putting in our spiritual bank so that we can make a deposit from it when we need to remember that God will come through. If we don't do that, I believe that's then coming at him with a half heart or not even a full heart, right? Maybe you've never seen God come through in your life in that way. So your first step is going to be a blind step or a huge step of faith to trust that God will come through. And sometimes those are scary steps. Even after we've seen him come through, many of us still have that fear of whether God can come through, right? And I think it's in those moments of that fear, the awness of God to lean into him is where our faithfulness in him grows. But if you have seen him come through, I would encourage you to remember those things. Put them and remind yourself of those things over and over again to build that faith muscle and that trust muscle. So, with all that, let's dive into today's story and unpack this, what we'll call crazy love triangle of Abram, Sarai, Hagar, and Ishmael. And an interesting note here, too, that Sarai and Abram will have a son named Isaac soon, right? And we know from history that both Isaac and Ishmael have been at conflict with each other from day one, right? Both are central figures today, even in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, right? They have this connection, this shared lineage through Abraham, who God will rename Abram shortly. And today we see Israelites and Muslims still in conflict, thousands of years later, all stemming from this selfish choice by Abram and Sarai. It's fascinating to me, right, when you read that and you see today what's going on, and all these years later, how one simple choice could lead to that, right? And it was made out of a lack of faith and trust and patience, which again floors me when we just learned about how good everything was going with Abram, right? But we'll get into that some more here as we get into God's word. So let's begin in chapter 16 with verse 1. It says, "Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, 'Behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her.' And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. In the NIV translation, it actually says, Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So I have to stop there and say, what? I mean, I know sometimes we can read more into things that are written down. Anyone ever do that with text messages? You read a little more into what's actually on there? I've done that, right? So we can blow things up in our mind, but Abram just agreed with her, period? Like with everything that God's already done for him, right? We'll read here in the next verses that he's been in Canaan for 10 years. So I can see maybe forgetting a few things over a decade, but a vision from God, an interaction with God, seeing God come through, man, mean, I'm not saying any of us are better than Abram, but dude, like, what are you doing, right? Let's continue in verse 3. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. So just so we're clear, this would be considered like a co-wife, right? It was common in those days. Be very easy to quickly judge Sarai here, but knowing the culture and the circumstances, it wasn't a far-fetched idea at all. And if you fast forward today with our line of thinking, when we see what this choice that they made, I think we do it all the time to God, all the time, in many different ways. We look for ways to circumvent or to go around God's plan to get to our timeline or to fit our needs. We do it all the time, right? So this moment and choice made by Sarai and Abram is rooted in an unbelief and a lack of trust in God. And we could come down on Abram, kind of like I was there a few seconds ago, but we have to understand that this just highlights our human tendency. Our natural human tendency is to rely on our own plans than to lean into God and to trust in His. Even someone where Abram, everything was going great with God, still was subject to those human tendencies, right? Let's continue with the story. In verse 4, it says, "And he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she had saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress." This is moving fast. The instant this child is being conceived in the womb, and Hagar knows that she's pregnant, it's like the beginning of conflict has started, right? So when we think about, in light of everything that's going on in the Middle East, this consequence began almost instantly with this child. And we'll explore that a little more in a moment here. Let's go on to verse 5. "And Sarai said to Abram, 'May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked at me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me.' But Abram said to Sarai, 'Behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please.' Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her." So this is kind of like one of those really fast-moving soap operas here. Quick version: wife gives servant to husband, and she is now the co-wife, who becomes pregnant and thinks, maybe now that I'm carrying Abram's baby, I can just replace Sarai as the main wife, right? But Sarai says, "No way, no how. This is my husband. I know I gave him to you, but I want backsies. I had him first." And she boots the slave girl to the curb. And what about Abram in all this? Well, he says, "It's been great. I've enjoyed it, but I'm staying out of it." All right. Funny version, but what really happened here? We see, Hagar, a slave girl, puts two and two together here, right? She's heard them praying and knows that they want an heir. So she says, well, wait a minute. If I'm carrying the heir, what do we need Sarai for, right? I mean, what slave girl wouldn't do that? Chance to slide right in there. And once this attitude is displayed, then Sarai jumps right on that, right? She's like, wait a minute, we made a mistake. So she tries to blame Abram, right? And Abram, like many men will do, finds the back way out, right? And says, you deal with this. This is your mistake. So as I was looking at this, we have a pretty, put together married couple here, right? Stepping together, arms linked, on the same page, right? Not. Just for a little simple plug to marriage, because I love working with marriages in our church. I've listened to several stories of tensions and conflicts and disagreements in marriages, and I've experienced them in my own marriage as well. And there's always one single common factor in every case without fault. The marriage that's trying to operate as one cannot do it with Christ at the center. right? And when we try to walk arm in arms linked with just the two of us, without God actually at the center holding on to those links, they will fall apart, they will push away, right? We have to realize that Jesus is exactly what holds the two together to become one. And I think right here in this story, we're seeing an example of where God was not at the center. They were trying to do things on their own, and then that also led to both of them, being harsh with each other, trying to blame each other, right? So if your marriage feels distant between the two of you, like maybe there's a wedge forming in there, definitely you can come in and talk anytime, but I would encourage you, is Christ at the center? Draw him back in and see how things begin to look different. All right? So up to this point, I believe what we have here, this story highlights how human actions driven by impatience and a lack of faith can lead to division and suffering. We're seeing that now, whether it's in the marriage, whether we're seeing it with the future nations that will be against each other. We have to realize that when our own human actions, without Christ moving forward, without us leaning into him, in some point will probably lead to this, right? And then there's the but God moment, right? God is always in control. Whether we're in step with him, whether we're distancing ourselves from him in a moment, he's still there, right? He's able to correct, forgive, guide, and restore. And we're going to see that play out here in this story as we go to verses 7 and 8. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going? She said, I am fleeing from my mistress, Sarai. Many scholars believe that the translation used here for angel of the Lord was more than likely God himself, or even in a form of Jesus, the Savior, here in the book of Genesis, right? And they arrive at this conclusion because similar translations in Hebrew use, where they're talking about God actually appearing, use similar words, right? And I mention that because that's pretty awesome, right? Here's Hagar, a servant woman, who's tied up in all this and then gets kicked out, and God goes to her, right? In her distress, he sees her. And I love, if you notice how he addresses her, it's not as co-wife. He addresses her as servant of Hagar, of Sarai. Because even though God will never forsake us or leave us, he will always direct things back to his plan, right? And Hagar becoming Abram's wife was not a part of his plan. And notice how he asks the gentle questions when he approaches her and talks to her, probably calming her down, right? To hear that gentle voice and just to know that, man, the God of the universe is calling me by name. It's pretty cool. And he didn't abandon her. And here's how it continues in verse 9. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her. The angel of the Lord also said to her, I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for the multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are pregnant, and you shall bear a son. You should call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, and his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen. Amazing how God works through human missteps, right? Hagar had to be elated. Not only did God call her out by name, but he actually gives her a name to call her son, which, in translation had meaning to it, which back then having meanings to your name were huge, right? That God sees her in her distress. God hears is the translation. So God heard the lowly cry of this distraught slave girl, caught up in this love triangle with a man that he called righteous that has gone and done this, right? And then he even makes a promise for her son. Let's go on to verse 13. So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, "You are a God of seeing." For she said, "Truly, here I have seen him who looks after me." Therefore the well was called Beer Loei Roal, my best translation. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. The meaning of this, though, is well of the living one who sees. In verse 15, and Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. So as the band begins to make their way back on stage for our final song today, let's wrap up this story of this lack of faith and trust, and how does it relate to us, right? One thing to remember is there are always consequences, right, for the choices we make, especially when we deviate from God's plan, right? So the unforeseen results here, like Ishmael, he will become what is considered the father of the Arabs in Muslim belief, right? This conflict between Arab nations and Israel will continue to go on throughout history and even today, all from this consequence, right? And some may ask, I asked, as I had to really ask God and dive into this, why would God do that? Why did he save Ishmael so that Islam could exist? A very religion that goes against Christianity, that wants to kill Christians, right? Why would God do that? And through my study, I found that we have to remember that God always keeps his promises, right? Despite what humans do. He made a covenant with Abram, and Ishmael is a part of the blessings that he promised Abram and his offspring, right? Even though there's a consequence that goes along with that, with Ishmael's lineage not being a part of the Christian line, God was still honoring his promise. And as we study further, we'll see that God allowed these two separate lines to exist so we can gain understanding that both there's a general blessing, the physical descendants of Abraham, like Ishmael, and then there's a specific blessing that God gave through the designated seed of Abraham, starting with Isaac, and then Jacob, and so on to Jesus. In the next chapter, chapter 17, God will make another covenant with Abram, and this is where he changes his name to Abraham and Sarai to Sarah. And this is the moment where he reveals that many nations will come from the promised son that they will soon have in Isaac. So I believe that God allows these two never-ending conflictual seed lines to exist for his people, us today, to see and fully understand God's sovereignty, right? What better way for us to fully understand how much in control God is that he allows this to happen? He keeps his promises, but in his timing, according to his purposes, and there are always going to be consequences when we deviate from that. And those affect the paths that we're on, right? Nothing stops God's will from carrying out, but sometimes our actions, because of our mistakes, he has to use those through consequences often to still fulfill his plan. So we can look at it like this. Even before we were born, we know God had a plan for us. He had a path for all of us to walk on, right? And his plan never changes. But our actions, our decisions, our choices can alter the original path that we were supposed to be on with God. But the beautiful thing is God is right there to direct us back to him. And though we may not be on that original path, we're on a new one that he's using to advance his kingdom. And that's the glory of taking communion together and remembering what Jesus did on the cross, because every single day we can begin to look forward to what God has for us, even if we've messed up. So as I read this story and studied this week, I wondered, are we capable to wait on God? I mean, Abram, who we all heard was close to God, right? Everything was going fine, and he wasn't able to wait. And the answer is no, we can't. In Matthew 16:24, Jesus told his disciples, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." When Jesus uses the word translated to cross here, it meant only one thing: crucifixion and death. Right? So Jesus has given us the answer to how we can have a complete faith and trust in him. To be a disciple is to follow, and to do what Jesus wants us to do, we must die to ourselves, right? The only way we can actually wait on God to do the things he asks us is to trust in him completely, a full surrender, right? And I know for some of us, sometimes it's really hard for some sins to live in where I believe God has fully forgiven me. And it's mainly because we don't forgive ourselves. And I want to share with you this morning that I believe when you're able to forgive yourself, it is the biggest proclamation to what Jesus did on the cross and through his resurrection. Because you're telling him, this is how much I trust what you did is real in my life, that I not only believe you forgive me, that I forgive myself. And now I can walk every day forward, not letting that sin, not letting that thing I did pull me down. Because it's those sins that usually hold on to us, lose their grip when our focus is solely on him. So on our own, we aren't patient enough to wait on God in his timing. On our own, we actually can't really see his sovereignty and his control. And that's why often we can't accept forgiveness or live in forgiveness. But I want to encourage you today that we can strengthen our faith and trust in him by the surrender of our weakness, which allows Jesus to have complete control of our life. This is an everyday commitment to surrender our lives to him. That's why often when we're up here preaching and we do say, like, every day you've got to surrender. Well, it's because of this. If we don't, we will be on our own. We will try to do things on our own, and it could lead to where we'll end up having to deal with consequences for something that never had to happen. All right? So I want to encourage you this morning, as we sing this last song, to focus on him, to love Jesus through our praise, and to thank him that every day we can go to him and surrender our human side of things to allow him to have control. So let's stand and let's sing this morning.